Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've come all the way from Central to Cyberport. I'm going to talk a little bit about IP for startups in the digital era, and some of the types of businesses that I saw shown on the screen are some of the issues that I would like to talk about. So I work for a law firm, and I lead the IP practice in Asia for this law firm. And over the years, I've advised a number of startups. So I remember, I'm old enough to remember the dot-com boom from the late 1990s. And I remember I was looking after an incubator at the time that had many companies in it, including some with wonderful names like Black Octopus and others like Alibaba. Can you imagine? That was a long time ago. So what I'm going to do today is to give you a little, overview of intellectual property rights, what they are, and what are the options. And I'm going to look at whether you should or should not register intellectual property rights, and what are some of the considerations, assuming that the budgets are not huge to do this, and that the spend on protecting IP rights is not necessarily cheap. And how should you prioritize? What should you register? What should you not register? What would investors look for when they're looking to give you a round A of investment, or a Series A, or even further? And what happens when you start bringing in partners into your business? What considerations should you take into account? How should you protect your rights? How should you make sure that these business partners that you're bringing are going to be the good partners that you think of them at the beginning, and how can you protect your interests? And then I'm going to look at some fun issues, like what happens if you're involved and you're developing technology that is largely based on artificial intelligence. Can that be protected? How can you protect? Are there any IP rights? What IP rights come into play? And how can you protect that? And what happens if we're talking about even more advanced things like quantum technology? What can you do with that? And how can you protect it? So you may all have heard, when we talk about intellectual property rights, there are 4 pillars. There's patents, there's copyright, there's trademarks, and there's designs, okay? And they vary in strength, and it can be quite bewildering. How do you choose? How do you decide? Which one shall you get? I can tell you that over dinner, over the years, I've been practicing law for over 25 years, and my husband is an academic, but not in the field of law. But all of a sudden, he has become an IP specialist and talks about it with other people and says, how should I copyright this trademark? And I'm like, you don't copyright a trademark, right? So let's get that straight. So the IP rights vary in strength. So they are monopolies. The reason for intellectual property rights is to protect the output of the human capital. So we give protection for the creation that human minds make, and this protection is rewarded with limited monopolies. The strongest monopoly that you can get is patent protection, and that you obtain for an invention, a process. So a patent protects an invention, and there are requirements for obtaining a patent. Anybody knows what those might be? So the invention has to be new. It can't be something that has happened before. It has to involve an inventive step, i.e. a person reasonably skilled in the art should not be able to find it obvious. Okay? And it has to be capable of industrial application. Otherwise, it's useless. I have in my office a lovely book of useless British inventions. And there's a lovely patent application that was made for a suction pad to take a spider out of a bathtub. Needless to say, that was never granted, a patent. But it's a quirky and interesting one to have happen. So it's a very strong monopoly, because for 20 years, nobody can do what you have done. It's 20 years, and we know that for some companies, like drug companies that you see there on the slide, There are ways in which that can be extended somewhat further by developing, by extending and building on the existing patent application. You may also have heard another IP right is copyright. What does it protect? It protects the expression of ideas, not the ideas. Somebody once famously said that there are only 4 plots for novels in the world. And what we have in literature across the globe and in different countries is variations on certain themes. That is quite a simplistic way of describing copyright. Copyright can take many forms. It can protect music. It can protect software. So for the purposes of startups and companies like those in the Cyberport ecosystem, software is an important one. In many jurisdictions, software is excluded matter from patent protection. So you can't, as of right, like you cannot get a patent for mathematical formulas, but you can get copyright protection for software. That is not perhaps the best protection that you can get, because somebody can come up with something that has similar functionality, provided the code is slightly different. They will not have infringed your material. It also, has protection for graphic designs, for layout, all sorts of things. So in your company, you constantly produce copyright material. Every brochure that you write is your copyright. Every packaging that you do for your products has copyright. So if anybody copies it, that is an infringement of your right. And there are trademarks. Trademarks are probably the weakest form of protection, but the ones that have the longest duration. So copyright, does anybody know how long does copyright last? Does it last forever? Yes, so it's the lifetime of the author plus, and now there are variations, 50 years in Hong Kong, 70 years in the European Union, and even more in the United States. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, Disney.
Walt Disney.
Yep.
That's the reason. It's the Mickey Mouse Extension Act, right? So depending on the types of work, so if it is a sound recording, that has a shorter copyright duration, and graphic designs have also shorter, copyright duration. Trademarks are the ones that last the longest. They last forever. They last initially for a term of 10 years, renewable every time for 10 years. So, for example, the Hong Kong Trademark Registry precedes the Trademark Registry of Britain by 1 year. So we have had a record of trademarks and a system for registering trademarks that is a year older than that in the UK. And you may be interested to know that one of the oldest trademarks in the UK on the register is one for beer. Isn't that amazing? Bass Beer has had probably the record in terms of one of the longest living trademarks. So they last forever, but the protection is very weak. I cannot stop, whilst with a patent, I can stop somebody from putting on the market a COVID vaccine that has the same technology as mine. Right? I cannot stop somebody from producing a vaccine, provided it's under it's not under my trademark. So if it's not my technology, so I can't stop you from making clothes, provided you're not using the same brand as mine. I can't stop you from selling books, provided you're not selling them under Amazon or whatever other name. But even trademarks are adapting to the times. So we now have trademarks that can encapture sounds. So before, they were just words and pictures and logos. Now, sounds can be trademarked. And one of the first to be trademarks was the one that Intel has. For if you remember the old times when you switched on the computer and that chip made the sound, dun, 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 right? That was the Intel sound that they had actually trademarked, the Nokia ringtone. You can also register as a trademark a smell. but it can't be something that you associate with a product. Okay, that would be not allowed. So, for example, the one that was refused in the EU is the smell of fresh cut grass for golf balls, or the smell of beer for darts when you're playing, darts in a pub. So, because they thought that the association was quite close there. We also have the fourth possible IP right is designs. Again, it depends on the type of business that you're in. So if you are developing products that have an aesthetic value, and you will try to register a design. And a registration of a design, basically, it has to be something that appeals to the eye. It's not going to be something that I see when I open the bonnet of a car, because that will be, functional. First of all, I have to see it, and it has to appeal to the eye, and it has to be different from something that has existed before. It's arguable, the value of a design. You can register it. You have to pay money to register it, but it's not examined. So it just, the registry will just look at formalities. It can be very easily challenged. At the end of the day, a watch is a watch is a watch. A teapot is a teapot is a teapot. And how much of a difference can it be? What is it that it is so different that would make it stand apart? So, of course, the people at Apple would argue that the case for their smartphone is actually sufficient enough to warrant a design. And finally, if you don't want to register and go through all that trouble, and we'll come back to the registration, requirements, and you just want to keep the information secret, because remember, with IP rights, and especially with patents, you actually have to disclose the invention to the world. That's the trade-off. Right? So the world is saying, I'm giving you this very strong monopoly, but in exchange, you are going to disclose your invention. The moment you file that patent application and it is published, it is disclosed to the world. And this will help us advance in our quest to improve the world and mankind. We will develop further technologies based on the blocks that have been put there by other people before us. But if you don't want to do that, then you're left with trade secrets, right? So that is something that is kept within a small group of people. The formulas, the recipes, the manufacturing processes, financial accounts, customer lists, whatever that has commercial value can be a trade secret. And of course, the most famous one is the Coca-Cola formula that we know is sitting in a vault somewhere, and it's only a closed, circle of people, members of a family, that have access to that formula. Can you see any potential problem with trade secrets? Think about that. If there is a problem with that, we'll come to it a bit later. So there is, I put here an example of IPR in a COVID vaccine, just to show how much intellectual property you can have just in, one product. What do we think we have? Johnson & Johnson is the trademark, logo, design, whatever.